Hello and welcome to another BuildASoil frequently asked question video. Today we've got FAQ number 7 for season 4, and as per usual, Dean has selected all of the questions, printed them out on this piece of paper. I have not read any one of the questions. That way we can keep my answers as candid as possible. Do my best to give you an answer just like I would give to a friend. So let's get started. Marius says, "Hi Jeremy." What's up, bro? "I love your videos, learning a lot from you. Question, all the pruning, low stress training, and the trellis netting, do you do the same on outdoor grows? I am new to growing and can only grow outdoors. Is it necessary to do all of that?" Yes and no. When you're growing 10-pound plants like you see in the poster behind me, there's gonna be a lot of trellising needed. If you're growing a large plant with the wind, with the bud size, with the moisture, the rain, all the things that can happen, the most devastating loss comes from growing a beautiful plant and having it just collapsed into the mud and shattered by the weather. So you absolutely have to do some trellising. However, let's say you live in a backyard where it's completely sheltered on all sides from the wind. In that case, you may be totally fine. I've grown a lot without trellising before. Outdoor growing, a lot of the plant size management is directly related upon your transplant time. And so for whatever reason, this is what I typically see with outdoor growers that are a little bit newer. They go, "Man, I'm gonna grow the biggest plant you've ever seen." And they start like the year before or like in January. And they grow indoor and they grow this huge plant and they're gonna go put it outside. And a lot of times I see a small seedling beat those plants. So what I'm getting at is that having a big plant to put outside is totally acceptable. But I think the limiting factor is that the container size, the trellising, the feeding aren't quite big enough for that big plant anyways. And the small seedling, when planted on time, would get just as big. And so that's just one consideration. I'd hate to see a 5-foot plant get put outside and then grow so big that it runs out of nutrients and you have a lackluster crop. I'd rather you see you put a smaller plant out a little bit later and have a medium-sized plant that's of the highest quality, easy to manage the whole time. So personally, I like to plant in like July in small containers. And then I'd get really nice plants with half-pound or more, but nothing bigger than a pound usually. And they're all manageable. They're not too tall, easy to harvest, easier for me to trim, and the quality is really good. You can do this by planting late, start your seedling or cut your clones and actually transplant outside in June or July. Around here, if you plant before June, which it's tempting, the weather's good in May, the weather will beat the hell out of your plants if you plant in May. The cold nights, the abusive wind, you'll look outside and you see your plant just flapping in the wind. So I'd advise waiting until the area that you live in has the best weather. And if you're trying to grow the biggest plants like the ones behind me, that was done in a greenhouse that had access to full season, the wind was controlled, and even still, massive amounts of trellising. Typically the green poles pounded in, trellising wrapped around all sides, plant grows into it, another set of trellis is put in, and there could be multiple sets. So all that I'm getting at is you have to do a lot of this, but one of the ones that you don't always have to do because it's a labor killer is you don't have to go defoliate every leaf. Inside we have a flat canopy and it is a little bit easier to kind of stack the work because we're gonna have to defoliate at least at the end anyways. But on large outdoor grow, like if I had 99 10-pound plants, I'm not gonna go through every one and spend 8 hours defoliating every leaf. I would just let them do their thing and not worry about it. So I would focus on the weakest link. If you've got one huge outdoor plant, you might go in there and fully defoliate as far as you can reach and do a really good job keeping it cleaned up. I don't think that's gonna really increase your yield or make such a dramatic difference. Indoors, I think it makes a pretty big difference. But outdoors, we've got the wind and weather and all these things that I think increase the airflow underneath the canopy and I think remove some of the reasons why we have to defoliate so hard. So trellising, absolute must. Make sure you get your trellis game on early. Some people will cage the plants, then go to trellises. Have a plan because if you don't, your plants are they're gonna snap or the whole bush can break. Now, genetics is a big key outdoors. If you've got the best genetics, and the best, what I mean is, good for your region. They'll handle the weather that you have. They'll finish before it gets too cold in your region. That's ideal. Indoors, we pick anything we want. But outdoors, I think, instead of trying to fight everything, you get genetics that are really good for outdoors. Strong side branching, less likely to break, resistant to mold and mildew, good for full season, will finish on time. In the 10x10 series right now, we're running a Royal Black Dog Kush from Rootwise, and all of his selections were made in his greenhouse outdoors to this area, and so they do phenomenal outdoors. They do great indoors, but it's like they go another level when you can put them in their proving ground where they were designed. And so when it comes to outdoors, if you've got buddies that grow in your area that swear they've got something that did really well, I would try it. And each year you can get slightly better at choosing which genetics did best for your area. But the short answer is yes, trellis. Defoliating may not be as important, right? But is important to trellis. Okay, next, Winslow says, hey Jeremy, huge fan of BAS. Thank you. If I was to transplant 5-gallon pots into a 2x4 grassroots living soil bed, would I be digging up too much living soil to transplant into the 2x4 bed? Would it defeat the purpose of no-till? Hope you see this. Thanks for everything you're doing. Winslow, this is a really good question. I'm happy we put it in here because it'll answer it for a lot more people. I'd say there's no real no-till that we're doing. We call it no-till because we're keeping the soil, we're not throwing it away. But buddies have called it low-till, and a lot of times because they're transplanting. You can see that some of the facilities at GLP Nevada, you can look up his grow. But over at that particular location, if you see their photos on Instagram, it's just beautiful. They do 1-gallon transplants with open bottoms directly on the bed. Now, I think it's genius because it removes the labor of having to dig it up, and labor is a big issue when it comes to keeping a tight schedule and keeping profit when it comes to farming. So we need to be really cognizant of extra labor wasters, and digging a whole bunch of 5-gallon holes could be a big amount of labor, but for you, not a problem at all. And of course, it's going to dig up that soil. And so many of us are really romantic about no-till in the sense that it's like, I never want to disturb anything. No fungal strands. I want all the worms, everything to be completely intact. But I feel like digging up your 5-gallon, putting it in there and going is totally acceptable. And if that's the weakest link for you, is that you'd rather have a big transplant to plug and play into your bed, do it. I don't see any problem with it. If you can find another way to get the same results in flower with transplanting a smaller transplant, I think that would be ideal, but it really doesn't matter. Like for instance, if you had a really stretchy strain, you might be able to transplant like a 1-gallon and still have a similar veg time because you take advantage of the stretch. You can see in our 10x10 series right now, the Royal Black Dog is short because it's not a stretcher, which is great for a number of reasons. But if I want it to stretch, the Fruit by the Funk is just unlimited stretch. And so I could have flipped a lot earlier. Those are kind of tactical advantages based on your genetics that you're running. So when it comes to digging up the 5-gallon, I would say don't be too hard on yourself if that's what you got to do. I don't think you're ruining living soil. I don't think you're going to get any less results than if you had just dug up a small amount. But I get why you're asking. I feel like once we've decided to do no-till, you feel like a hypocrite for tilling it at all, even if you're just transplanting. But the goal remains the same. We need to grow our plants, and we're doing it for that only. That's the only purpose. So do it. I will say that the cause of the problem that you're having is because you're wanting to transplant 5 gallons. My suspicion is that you're vegging in one area and you're transplanting into big beds, and you'd rather veg in a 5-gallon to make it easy, transplant and flip to flower pretty quickly. I totally get it, and a lot of facilities have dealt with this. Some have gone to just vegging in their beds and rolling the whole bed into the flower room. Some have just extended the veg time in the flower area a little bit longer and transplanted smaller ones, but I don't think it's a problem at all. Okay, hopefully that answers your question. It was a really good one. All right, Arizona. Arizona says, where do the Rove beetles come from? Good question. I highlighted this, and so obviously we're getting some questions about it. I think that Rove beetles are phenomenal, and it's a very important part of the process. I don't recommend buying lots of them if you can get them naturally. So they're going to come from BuildASoil, they're going to come from the Colorado Worm Company compost, sometimes in the worm castings, but typically the reason why is they are omnivores. They can eat a lot of different things. So not only do they eat the fungus gnat larva and fly larva and all the things that we don't like, they also can survive on a number of items. And so they'll be able to persist. And if you're top dressing with compost, the Ole Mountain has it, Cooko has it, there's going to be Rove beetles, which is great because you can go spend hundreds of dollars on Rove beetles to try and buy them and inoculate your grow with them. I just recommend against that because if you're using compost, you'll have them, and typically in numbers that are higher than average. And we want to avoid that because the last thing we want to do is just trade fungus gnats for Rove beetles when it comes to the herb. But I will tell you, I'd much prefer to have Rove beetles. They typically only climb up so far. They get on the exterior of a plant. They're pretty easy to remove. Of course, with anything in living soil, we don't want to have massive populations of any one species. We'd like to have an ecosystem, kind of a balance. And I've noticed that when you do a no-till for a while in larger containers, those things kind of come to a balance. But it seems like the earth box or the auto pots, for whatever reason, maybe because of the top dressing in the smaller container, it can kind of proliferate. And so it's up to you. There's some people that actually attach like an inverted cup to the stalk or any way to try and stop them from climbing. As far as your question, where do they come from? They are beneficial and they don't do damage to plants, and so we encourage them, and they usually come from compost, along with predator mites and a number of other things. Just like Rove beetles, if you have those little bulbous predator mites that come in the compost, and you have a really thick, wet mulch area with tons of cut leaves and everything, you can boost that population a little too high, and when they're running out of material, some of those will actually climb up your plant. So regardless, in living soil, we want to be cognizant, but typically the beneficials are going to come from the compost. Okay, Dev has a question and says, you mentioned that you keep airflow low and moisture high in your male tent. I thought that was the recipe for powdery mildew for vegging plants. Is it not? No, actually, I've found that having moisture medium is where you get powdery mildew, or even low. You can research it, and it can definitely live in higher humidity, and it's ideal, but I don't get powdery mildew in the sense that the plants are healthy. And so powdery mildew is ubiquitous. For the most part, unless you have an infested, like an infected plant that's been weakened, I don't see it become an issue. Over the last 10 years and back to back grows, I've never had a powdery mildew issue here in the grow. I think we've maybe seen on one grow some small instance in late flower that never persisted later. So we've been pretty lucky, right? I don't want to just rely on luck, but a lot of that comes from the living soil system and having good plant health. Obviously, I'm not going to grow these males to full fruition. I see no powdery mildew in there whatsoever, but I'm not smoking it, so it wouldn't be the end of the world, I guess, right? I just want to collect the pollen. But no, there's no powdery mildew in there. And if you do research on powdery mildew, there's hundreds of different types, and they can persist in many different environments, and they are everywhere. Some spores are probably in my lungs right now. They're floating around the air. So my goal is to have healthy plants that resist that, don't become infected by it. Typically, in living soil, where I see people get powdery mildew is when they have plants that are brought back from the brink of death. And during that weakened time, they were able to be infected, and now the healthy plant now can't get rid of it because it's fully anchored. And you can do things to get rid of it, but it is a lot harder when it's really taken hold. So take that for what it's worth. But in the tent, my weakest link in there was I do not want to get pollen anywhere. So no airflow, a little bit lower light to keep them from growing so vigorously because they're in smaller containers, and this will keep the plant health. Had I cranked the light in those small containers, I would have been up against it to feed them. That would have declined the health, and maybe I could have gotten powdery mildew. But I focused on keeping the light low to keep them super healthy. And I live in a dry climate, so the moisture in there's a decent amount in there, but it's not excessive. Hopefully that helps answer your question. Okay, that was a good one. D says, do you sell lights? I want quality lights. Yes, we sell lights. We offer the High Grove, which is what we carry. It used to be timber grow lights, and we carry them because we had a relationship with them. Was always good at customer service, building a lot of them, or building all of them in California from parts that they ordered, and doing a really good job. And so we wanted to back them. At the end of the day, really, we've carried multiple different light brands, and we still do. We carry Illuminar. We're looking at other light brands just to make sure that we have all the different models that are available. And so look for new grow lights coming to BuildASoil.com soon. Otherwise, go to BuildASoil and look up the High Grove, and you'll see the lights that we're currently using in the 10x10, and they are definitely available for purchase right now. Jack says, you mentioned worms in the 3x3. When did you add them to the take and bake? I must have missed that. I didn't add them to the take and bake. I added, I believe season 2 or 3, I added some Coco, and they just came, and now there's worms all over. Same thing in the 4x4 bed with the Coots recipe, because I used half Coco. It didn't add any worms, but now it's completely full of worms. So inside the Colorado Worm Company castings, there's cocoons and occasional baby worms. And every bag that I've ever used, I've been able to find at least one. But typically what happens, even if you don't see them, is once you use the Colorado Worm Company castings, some of the cocoons that you don't see are going to hatch, and then there's going to be worms, and it will start a population. I don't want to guarantee it, but that's how I got ours. And it seems to be that they're so fresh, homemade, that it's almost like a given that that's going to happen. Otherwise, oftentimes what I do is I order worms in, and I start a worm bin, and from that worm bin I'll grab a few handfuls and I'll put them in my containers. But in the 3x3, that's just how it happened with us, was the Colorado Worm Company castings. So if you're watching and you want to try it, check out Alex's castings. Well, really his whole family makes them. Him, his kid, and his wife, and the animals. Really, the whole farm's a part of the process, so that's pretty cool. But anyways, check out the Colorado Worm Company castings. I don't think you can go wrong with those. Chris says, are all the soil recipes you sell considered living soil, including the Coots Take and Bake Kit? Yes. Yes, in fact, we're going through labeling and trying to make a full printed bag for all 50 states. And one of the catches is using the word living. They want us to quantify the amount of life that's in it. And I feel really foolish guaranteeing microbes on a bag, like literally writing the microbe name and the amount that's in there. I'll leave that to a microbial product. I think that once you put it in the bag, I can't guarantee what's in there, but I guarantee you there's life. And when it comes to compost, that's what makes the living component. Even if you take compost and get it aged and old and dry, I believe once you plant roots into it or get it moist, it's going to be teeming with life again. And so the living soil, the verbiage comes from the forums where we were trying to say, look, we're not just buying potting soil. We're making a soil with a high percentage of compost and adding rock dusts and things that mimic soil on a healthy farm a lot more than a bagged potting soil would. And that's what we wanted to coin, the living soil, because that would interact with the roots and start to take the whole process in consideration where we're feeding the soil, we're not feeding the plant. The soil takes care of the plant. That's a living soil. Where if you're just bypassing the soil using chemicals or using water-soluble nutrients 100% of the time for all of your nutrition, it's kind of like putting an IV in the arm, and you're no longer a living soil. I'd say that you're more hydro at that point. And so that's really the discussion. Every one of our recipes is a living soil. I would say arguably the one that may be the least living soil would be our Heady Starts seedling soil, as that's really designed for porosity and for texture, but it does have worm castings because we really don't want to compromise on that in any of our recipes. So for what it's worth, the living part of it came as a way to differentiate ourselves on the forums from people that were just growing in soil, which soil at that time was anything you'd buy in a bag that was not hydro, right? People were calling ProMix soil. And so we stuck with that, and that's what we've all called it over the longest time, was living organic soil. And I think that's the term that came before we called it no-till, because many of us were recycling the living organic soil in the beginning by dumping it out of its smaller containers, re-amending it, and putting it back in smaller containers. But it's better in a larger ecosystem, so a lot of us started going to large containers and keeping the soil and not throwing it out and never disturbing it. So some people call it undisturbed living soil, low-till, no-till, many different words, all really meaning the same thing. And it's just a grasping at communication to share with someone what we're talking about. So all of them are living soil recipes. I hope that helps answer your question. Certainly the Take a Bake, lots of compost, lots of minerals, lots of amendments. It's definitely alive. It comes alive when you mix it. But I truly think a soil is really living when plant roots are growing into it and we have that communication between the life of the plant and the life of the soil. Thanks, Chris. Last question on my sheet for FAQ 7 Season 4. S says, can we get a sales video on Rootwise where you compare the ingredients to some of the other big names in the market, like OG BioWar, Mammoth P, Great White, Recharge, etc.? I think it's a really good idea. I've, as a business owner, stayed away from comparing to other product brands. I know it's pretty normal when you get to big brands out there. Like you can see like as compared to, and it's kind of like a knockoff of the big brand. Or you go down the grocery store and you can buy like the knockoff Fruit Loops and there's the other one down the way. And it's clearly that they're trying to do that. Now that doesn't mean I'm going to release a knockoff product, but I still try and stay away from like directly mentioning other brands in comparison, mainly because I don't believe we need to. I really believe our products are the absolute best and they stand apart on their own. But as we get larger, I'm realizing that many people they're not given the benefit of years of watching this develop to just know that, man, these are really good products built with all the right intent. Replacing, like Rootwise replaces azos and it replaces mycos and it replaces some of the phosphorus solubilizers all in one product, and it's made at a lab in the United States where it's not imported from overseas, which is a whole nother world. There's so much bullshit in the microbial world, especially when buying from overseas, especially when people aren't able to verify via DNA sequencing and other things what they're actually getting. They're just placing a lot of trust as a small company into their vendor. I think we could get to a comparison where I put like, here's every ingredient in here. It's pretty basic. I mean, some of them have like Bacillus subtilis. Well, you can see that's in Rootwise of multiple versions, and it's easy to compare. So I see the benefit. I'm just explaining myself because like I'd like to do it, but I also don't. I think it might be worth it. I know that there's enough confusion out there where I could at least go down and say, hey, look, Mammoth is good for phosphorus solubilization, and it does it through this mechanism. The Rootwise has a different way of doing it based on the lab and whether it's dry or liquid, and there's some arguments there, but I believe Rootwise is the much better product, and so I think that it would be easy for me to do. Great White's been around forever, but you got to understand a lot of these products that are marketed to the cannabis community are literally just repacks of like Myco Apply, who's been around forever, registered in all the different states. There's only a couple of different mycorrhizae like manufacturers in the world, or at least that we have access to. You know, Canada, there's some in the United States, there's only a couple. And so most people are going to go to a Myco Apply, get some sort of product, put their brand label on it, call it a day. So we can get down into it. I really do think we can. I think it's a good question. I'm not going to promise a date on it, but what I'd like to do this right is list out the different products that we'll compare and get an accurate listing of what's in them. And still, even then, what you're going to find is because of the labeling laws, many of these products will have more than is on the label in them, and they just can't figure out how to communicate it effectively across 50 states. Meaning one state will approve this microbe, the other one won't, and so you end up with kind of a reduced label. And I think that's part of the problem when it comes to how organic producers are held to almost a higher standard. It's like if we could just call it a chemical and move on with it, there'd be a label for it for sure. But when you're dealing with microbials, it becomes a little bit confusing, even though they're super beneficial. So good question. I definitely see that a possibility, but I don't want to put a time frame, and I'll talk to Kevin about this just to make sure I bounce ideas off of him so that I do my best at displaying this. I think when I'm going to be comparing any other brand, it's most important to be very accurate and speak the truth, because I'm likely, as a salesperson, as a friend of Kevin from Rootwise, maybe be a little right, a little bit biased. And so I'll be very transparent about that in the video that I make. But I think that as long as I can do it where any manufacturer could look at the video and say, hey, it was a fair assessment, then I will do the video. So thank you so much for all these questions. I really appreciate every one of you who writes in, and I wish I could answer every single one of these FAQs on camera. Our goal is to do that over time. Thank you so much, and like, subscribe, tell your friends about these videos, share them. It really helps answer questions for others. I'll see you guys on our next BuildASoil YouTube.